handing over to Russel.
Kia ora, and thank you, Sens and Abby, and my apologies for running late. I'll talk about why I was running late a bit later. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's great to see you all, and thank you very much for coming on this afternoon. My plan here is to talk for a little while, and then we open up for questions and conversation. My topic is campaigning in the age of COVID. That's the kind of rough topic. So what I want to do with that topic is start by just giving a bit of a theoretical view about what is campaigning and how it works normally. And then talking a little bit about how COVID changes some of that theoretical frame, and then what that means practically for some of our work currently at Greenpeace. So if that's all right, I'll get underway. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Hello. Right, okay. So what I wanted to start with was a simple theoretical frame for thinking about the kind of work that Greenpeace and others do is to think about society in three parts: civil society, the state, and the economy. So it's the kind of it's an old analysis, but I think a valuable one for understanding the kind of work that campaigners do. So if you have these three components to this thing, so you have civil society, which is where the agents in civil society tend to be not-for-profit agents or NGOs, groups like Greenpeace and many others, of course. They kind of form the agents who operate in civil society. Though civil society is much bigger than just the NGO sector. So that's kind of one part. And then, of course, you have the state, and the agents in the state are essentially government departments, not only government departments or government agencies. That's kind of the sector which also has the monopoly on the use of state violence and force, but also has access to enormous resources that come from that, especially financial resources and lawmaking resources. And then the third sector is the economy. And so the kind of key agents in the economy are corporations and businesses, and they largely dominate what happens in the economy. So if you have those three sectors as a theoretical frame, so the economy, the state, and civil society, and now those three sectors obviously are not completely separate from each other, far from it. In fact, they're constantly interacting with each other. And a key part of what campaigners are doing is generally we operate in civil society, and we try to influence the actions of the state and the business sector, the economy. Primarily, if we're campaigning on anything really, climate change, you name it, what we're usually doing is using the freedom and the space of action that we have in civil society, which is very significant. We use that space of action in order to change the course of history. And pretty much every change in the course of history that's ever happened is initiated from civil society. By its nature, civil society is less rule-bound than the state and the way the state operates, or the economy. If you're operating as a business, you have some freedom of action, but market tends to create certain constraints on that. And likewise, if you're operating in the state, you have a series of constraints that operate on you. Government departments have a lot of latitude, but they don't have all that much. So civil society, on the other hand, is a place where you can generate a lot of change from, and pretty much all kinds of change start there. So the one way to think about it is that we mobilize power in civil society, and then we use that power to influence the state, and we use that power to influence the economy. If you think about it, looked at from the point of view of the agents, one of the key agents that operate in the state, political parties. Political parties are heavily influenced by the way people see the world, by the mindsets that people have, that voters have. has a huge impact on what politicians think they can or can't do, and what in reality they can or can't do. So civil society actors are constantly acting within civil society to influence mindsets, or hearts and minds. And by influencing hearts and minds, we in turn create license for political parties to do or not do certain things. So it has a direct impact, our work in civil society, on the state. It also has a direct impact in the terms of the way businesses work. If you to think about it crudely, the whole rise of the kind of green consumer and that whole sector is in many ways a function of all the work that the environment movement has done over a very extended period to create, if you like, a market for green businesses. So changing hearts and minds not only influences the hearts and minds of voters, it also influences the hearts and minds of consumers, and in turn that influences what businesses believe they can make money from, and hence their investment decisions. So the work we do in civil society is able to have those kind of two effects. And of course, it's a lot more than that as well when you think about the influence of business on the state, which is very significant. As we've built up a kind of part of the economy, which might be called the green or sustainable part of the economy, and we can debate about how green and how sustainable and how big that is, but that growing sector of the economy in turn does have an influence inside the state, because we know that economic narratives are privileged within the state and have an enormous influence in terms of what people who operate in the political sector believe is possible or not, is very heavily influenced by what business people say is allowed or what is acceptable or not. So the kind of power that we mobilize by winning hearts and minds and changing the way people see the world in civil society has a kind of cascading effect across the state and across the economy. And by mobilizing that power, over time, we're able to achieve our goals in terms of sustainability. And the kind of power that we can mobilize, there's obviously a lot of tactics as to how you mobilize that power, and I'm going to get into those in a second, but the basic idea remains the same regardless of the tactics. Okay, so I'm sure you all know, I've heard all this before, but I think it's worth just kind of repeating because it kind of creates a common theoretical frame. Theory can't give us everything. Theory, nonetheless, is, I believe, essential in order to understand the world and how we're going to change it. So, okay, so if that's the kind of theoretical frame, then the next question. The next question is what's the impact? What's the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of how this all works? And the first impact in the short to medium term is to dramatically increase the power of the state relative to the two other sectors. So what we're seeing globally, but also here in New Zealand, is a tremendous strengthening of the position of the state relative to both of the other sectors, and that's has many manifestations. So on the one hand, the manifestation is that as the economy has run into a lot of trouble, a lot of businesses are highly dependent now on state support, and that's likely to continue well into next year, if not beyond, in various forms. So the state has become highly instrumental in the business, in decisions that businesses are making, in terms of their investment strategies, in terms of their employment strategies, in terms of their sustainability strategies. The opinion of the government about all of those things matters a lot more today than it did 3 months ago. The state is highly influential. And there's a real concentration of power within the state. So it's not just the kind of fast-tracking RMA bill, it's the whole process of keeping government to account has become, has essentially shrunken. So the normal processes that apply to government decision-making are now highly constrained. And there's dramatically less oversight over what government's doing than there was 3 months ago. And that's kind of an almost inevitable function in a way of all crises. But this one in particular, because of the economic crisis and the retraction of civil society, which I want to talk about in a second, that the latitude of action of the state currently is dramatically greater than it was 3 months ago. And it's likely to remain so for the next foreseeable months, for some considerable time. And if you're a campaigner who wants to change the world and have a more sustainable planet, then this is highly significant to your campaigning strategy and tactics. It's extremely significant in terms of how you need to influence, or how you could influence results. The other sector that I want to talk about is civil society, which is kind of more interesting. The kind of power of the state's very interesting, and kind of has a lot of dimensions to it that is worth getting into. But if we can say as a general level, like, it's been strengthening, it's much stronger, it's much more powerful, and it's much more centralized with much less oversight, as a kind of summary of the current position of the state. But then if we look at civil society, it's a bit more nuanced. On the one hand, civil society looks retracted. Look at us all hiding away in our little private residences, hidden from the world, and in a sense unable to connect face to face with each other. So much of what goes on in civil society does involve face to face connection. It's just one of the realities of civil society and how it functions. It's how we've become. It's how civil society evolved, of course. And so our ability to conduct ourselves in the usual manner is by necessity highly disrupted, dramatically disrupted, and we're all obviously experiencing this no end. On the other hand, there's something very interesting that's going on as well, which is the way that we are connecting with each other, which is novel, and not always better than it was. Sometimes it is, though, and shows the resilience, I think, of civil society. The way that we are through, I guess, in some ways, this wouldn't have been possible without the rise of the digital revolution. But nonetheless, here we are. We have found ways to connect with each other, even though it's not face to face. Virtually, we are connected. Look at us here today. And I think we're all experiencing this very interesting connections. I don't know about you, but I've been talking to people on video conference calls that I haven't talked to for some time, making connections with people that I should have had video conference calls. I don't know why I wasn't doing video conference calls with some of my friends in the States or whatever, like ages ago. It almost seems incomprehensible to me now. But and people up and down the country, like normally my first instinct previously was, let's hold a public meeting or whatever. But now it's like, no, let's hold a video conference call. And basically, no matter where you are in New Zealand, you have exactly the same threshold of access as everyone else. Whereas if you hold a public meeting in Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, well, basically, it's quite a big hassle to access those public meetings, even for the people that live in those cities, let alone everyone else. So there's some kind of interesting things going on, right? And also at a kind of theoretical level, community itself is a kind of imagined thing. Because even though we have a lot of face-to-face communication, a lot of what it means when we think about being a New Zealander is highly imaginary, in the sense that we have to create it. We don't actually have a literal town hall meeting of every person in New Zealand once a week, where we all get together and recreate the New Zealand community every week. We actually create a series of institutions. Those institutions we're not part of. We vote for people, we have media, we have all sorts of ways that we come together and see ourselves as part of a nation, or even better still, as part of a planet. But those civil society identities that we have created, such as New Zealander, such as Aucklander, whatever, those civil society identities were, when you really think about it, were always quite virtual. They weren't really built on all of Auckland coming together every week to make decisions. You know, there was an element of those civil society identities that was always quite virtual. And so the idea of this kind of online activism or virtual activism, which is, we'll talk about in a minute, but obviously we're all doing more of, in some ways isn't so antithetical to the imagined communities or the civil society identities that we've had previously. There's a famous book by Benedict Anderson, who was a critical theorist who's called, he called nationalism an imagined, what do you call it, an imagined community. And so that sense, when you build these very large communities, bigger than the groups that we evolved in, the groups of 50 or 100 people that humans evolved in, as we've built these larger and larger societies and communities, they have by necessity have had to be virtual or imaginary communities that we've had to imagine and create identities for ourselves. And there's been obviously powerful vested interests at various times who've sought to build those identities. But nonetheless, we never met face to face as all of New Zealand, ever, never will. It's never going to happen. And so the idea that we are now in an almost entirely virtual campaigning world is not so strange from where we were before, where we had access to face-to-face campaigning as well as virtual campaigning, because we always had to do it. It's just now, it's all we got. So in terms of civil society organizing. So in terms of how it's changed, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, sorry. How it's changed in terms of campaigning under COVID, there's some very interesting things that are happening, and they're not all terrible, right? There's some very problematic things in terms of concentration of power in the state, and we need to be super alert to that. There's some very interesting things happening in terms of disruption of economic power and business power. So that's been happening, and there's some very interesting things happening in terms of disruption of civil society power. I want to talk about Greenpeace and how we've been responding to this kind of new world. But before I do, I want to bridge just by talking a little bit more in depth about civil society. And I want to talk about institutions versus grassroots, which might seem a little bit of a stretch, but it's relevant to this. That if you think about the way civil society organizes, institutions form kind of nodes, if you like, in the social network. Sound like Facebook now, right? But institutions like Greenpeace and many other kinds of institutions, NGOs, not government institutions, not economic institutions, or like a business, but in terms of civil society. Institutions like Greenpeace form these social nodes. So Greenpeace has masses of connections. You look at us on social media, we have, 250,000 followers, whatever, on Facebook, and we have massive email lists, and blah, blah, blah. So we form this important node within the social network, right? It's an institution in the sense that we have paid staff, we have legal identity. We have all of those institutional trappings, for better or worse, right? Institutions have got swings and roundabouts, right? And so the fact that Greenpeace is an institution is highly relevant at a moment like this, when you have this massive disruption and a breakdown in the ability to have normal face-to-face connections, right? So some of the other more grassroots organizing that happens in civil society is tremendously important. You think about the rise of the climate strikers, very much non-institutionalized or not highly institutionalized kind of activity, very important. Extinction Rebellion, similar kind of thing, a huge kind of wave of energy flowing into the climate movement, right? But these aren't highly institutionalized movements. They're like, I would call them grassroots kind of things. They're throwing all this energy into the movement, but they're not really highly institutionalized in a way that Greenpeace is, with, all these staff and money and stuff that we try to, well, as much money as we can hang on to in the middle of all of this, but we're trying to, we try to build these ongoing institutions. The reason why this is relevant right now is that in the context of COVID, being able to target the state and the way the state functions is very, very important at this moment. And institutions have much greater resilience to do that at this time. It's just the reality of, it's very difficult to do your regular grassroots face-to-face kind of campaigning in this context. Some of the virtual campaigning is also obviously still entirely viable at this moment, but by having the institutions and organisations, you're in a better position to do that kind of virtual campaigning, because Greenpeace and organisations like Greenpeace have these kind of ongoing nodes within the network, right? And so these kind of institutions that survive through this crisis and are still functioning in the middle of this crisis are very important. You find them in the economic sector as well. So the economic sector are in there. You have all those businesses, the large businesses, big institutions in the economy. Some of them are downsizing, they're doing all sorts of things, but they're still very active, and they're still in their lobbying. They are in those virtual doors just like we are. But these institutions that can survive through a lockdown and can survive through a crisis and have the ability to have an ongoing impact on government are tremendously important in terms of influencing outcomes. And so it's been a very interesting period to see the way that civil society, it's also happening in the economy, but the way civil society and the institutions of civil society have been able to maintain their kind of influence at a time when the state is so tremendously important to what's going on. So if you kind of just to kind of step back from a second and just to kind of persist with my three-legged stool argument. So civil society, the economy, the state, right? So we move into this COVID crisis, centralized power in the state. You come into this very turbulent period for businesses in the economy, but the strong institutions are still strong. Likewise, in civil society, some of the face-to-face grassroots organising is extremely difficult and basically impossible in this context, but the virtual stuff carries on, and maybe a lot of virtual civil society kind of campaigning. We did a lot of that anyway, right? So, and we can keep doing a lot of that, and some of the key institutions can survive and continue to survive. So as we move into this period then, what's Greenpeace doing? Well, one of the key things we're doing is we are building virtual communities and virtual campaigning. It's something we've always done before, but of course it's become even more important. And so we're diverting some of our resources into this kind of work. You'll see on this call some of the people from our actions and mobilizations team who are more comfortable climbing the side of a boat or having some kind of campaigning like that, riding a boat or going down the side of a building, or in Abby's case, up the side of a building. We're rediverting some of our people and our capacity into more of the virtual campaigning work. So that's one thing we're doing, and we've got a lot of experience in that, and so we're doing that. But the other thing we're doing is we are very much using our access to the state. Obviously, it's quite convenient that at this time, as opposed to after the Christchurch earthquake, which was a different kind of crisis, there's probably more access for an organisation like Greenpeace into a government like this than there was previously during the Christchurch rebuild in terms of access to the state. But the job of institutions like Greenpeace at a moment like this is to basically divert a lot of resource into lobbying, which isn't, we don't normally divert a lot of resource into lobbying. It's one of the things we do, and it's kind of one of our staples, but it's not a huge part of what we do, right? Normally, we're much more focused on grassroots campaigning, virtual campaigning, civil society campaigning, all that kind of work. And we do a bit of lobbying, but our view generally is you win the hearts and minds and the politics will follow, you know. But at a moment like this, when the state is to some extent unshackled and is freed of some of its constraints and some of its connections, at least for the short term, it's tremendously important to be able to influence state actors because they are about to spend basically a decade's worth of discretionary government spending in 6 months. And so we are about to see billions of dollars flow into various projects and parts of the economy and society. And so it is critical at this moment that not only do we do the virtual campaigning, so we've been doing, trying to win hearts and minds, and so you'll see Greenpeace, I think it's fair to say was first out of the block in terms of its green COVID response and greening the COVID response and Build Back Better, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure you've seen all our stuff around that. That's about creating a license for a progressive government or a progressive minded minister to spend some of that billions of dollars on things that are good for biodiversity, good for the climate, good for addressing inequality. Right? So we've been doing all of that kind of work to create a virtual campaign, but a social license for those who want to do good things in the government, and there are many of them, that they have the space in which to advocate for that. And so all of that kind of basic campaigning work is tremendously important, and we've been doing lots of that. But it's also really important that we do the direct lobbying stuff in a way that it seldom is important, is so important as it is now. When I used to work in politics, a lot of people would lobby me about all sorts of things. Oh, I've just gotten bigger. A lot of people would, it's like looking at yourself, oh my God, that's me. A lot of people would lobby you about stuff, right? And lobbying is important, right? Really important. But a lot of the power doesn't come from necessarily the lobby itself, right? The power comes from, like, can you control the narrative in the broader society? Are you a privileged player in the political discourse, like from big business? Or do you have a big movement behind you? Have 100,000 people just marched up the street in support of your cause? All of those kinds of things, right? So lobbying is important, but generally the power doesn't come from the lobbying, right? The power is elsewhere, right? The lobbying is just the icing on the cake. But at a moment like this, it's a little bit different. Now we have to do the mobilizing of power, which we're doing, right? And not just Greenpeace, but many other people have got in behind the, the Build Back Better thing and all of that. And it's been fantastic. And I no doubt some of you have been doing all of that, promoting those ideas, which is really important. The only thing I'd say is that at this moment, all of that work's essential, but it's also essential, the lobbying work, because of the unshackled nature of state power. And so Greenpeace, like, we have been spending hours in meetings with ministers and CEOs of government departments and senior public servants and all the rest of it in a way that we seldom do. And we've been pulling every string that's within our reach. And the reason is simply that I've just put you back to gallery view because it's just like, so is it still spotlighted, Abby, like you wanted it? Yeah, okay, all right. I've just put myself back to gallery. It's too distracting. So the kind of lobbying dimension of it all has become, at least for the short term, tremendously important. And so the work, the kind of, we've been doing quite detailed policy work in terms of our COVID response, what a stimulus package look like, what the infrastructure spend should be. We've been engaging with government agencies about what the criteria should be for the big infrastructure spend. We're just about to release, we've just done a whole bunch of work on what regenerative agriculture infrastructure spending would look like. And the reason I was late is I was just talking to Damien O'Connor about, and a whole bunch of MPI officials about regenerative agriculture and what a stimulus package would look like. And basically when a minister wants to give you extra time, I kind of just trying to juggle it so that, to trying to lobby him about, how it goes. So yeah, so we've been kind of doing that kind of work in a way that we haven't before so much. And so that's the real pivot. So the campaigning is obviously the campaigning is all virtual, but it's quite focused to try to influence this once in a generation spender, which we're not going to see again for a long time, right? So that virtual campaigning is all about setting the frame, permitting people to invest in the good stuff, right? To influence this once in a generation spender. Which is huge. But then on the other hand, we're also doing much more of the, we used to say wearing out the leather on your shoes was, the lobbyist kind of thing, but it's not like that over Zoom. It's like getting sore ears from earbuds. But so we're doing a lot more of that kind of work as well, which I think at this moment, at this particular juncture with the state unbridled, has become critically important. So that is it. So that's kind of the guts of what I think is happening in terms of like at a theoretical level of what this moment means for campaigners and how the space is moving. But I also think, so I've tried to paint the picture about that, but I've also just tried to paint the picture specifically about how Greenpeace has been responding to that changed in kind of theoretical framework and practical framework that we're dealing with. And I might just stop there. That's enough talk from me. And if you have any questions or comments, I'm very happy to listen or respond.
Brad, thank you so much, Russell. Yeah, if folks have questions, you can either type them into the chat box, which I'm keeping an eye on, or if you go down to the bottom of your screen and hit reactions, there's an option to either clap your hands or raise your hand, and you can raise your hand and I will unmute you so you can ask your questions. So feel free. Any questions you have, go for gold. Oh. Sorry, I'm trying to switch off my gallery view so I can unmute people. Mel, you have a question. Let me in.
Yep, hello. Thank you, Russell, for that. Sorry I was a bit late, so I don't know if I missed anything, but just wondering in general if you have any advice for people not in a big institution like Greenpeace on how to effectively lobby local or central government.
Yeah, so there's nothing really beats just a personal kind of connection. I mean, in such a small country like this, like writing an individual letter or an individual email, obviously you can't make a meeting to have a face-to-face. Then maybe, I don't know whether electorate MPs are still doing virtual kind of, whether they're still meeting people virtually, I don't know. But certainly offering to meet people virtually over Zoom or something, that kind of basic work, that kind of work is really valuable. I mean, you just can't really, can't replace it. And then there's just the kind of the adding to the overall narrative about Build Back Better or whatever it is you want to, whatever particular message, but just keeping that going. Like we need to, one of the things obviously that's going to happen, if you think about the political logic of looking forward, like it's like we've had the health crisis and the government's looking like it's done a good job on the health crisis is the kind of predominant narrative. What's likely to happen is we move into the second part of the year and we're more likely to see some of the economic impacts. The voices from the economy are going to regain their footing. And they're going to become louder. And so maintaining a discourse or a narrative or a conversation about the importance of climate change, biodiversity, inequality, and Build Back Better, the work that we've got a bit of momentum on at the moment, every opportunity to add comments on an article, social media work, all that kind of stuff is still highly valuable to maintain, because we've built up a bit of head of steam, I think, about Build Back Better. There's been quite a bit going on. And I think maintaining that through all the usual online connections, comments and articles, social media, all that kind of stuff, I think is really important. And I mean, Duncan Garner's still running AM. I don't know if you watch it, but if you do, send stuff in. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's still lots of avenues to provide feedback and have an influence on the debate.
Great, thank you. Tony, you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's really wonderful to hear the kōrero from Greenpeace and what Greenpeace as an organisation is doing. My question, I do a bit of work with Essential, sharing out kai, and that's I've been one of the essential workers with a small organisation, and I've noticed there are many small organisations and groupings that are working in the community to share food and do a lot of different work. And I was just interested to ask Greenpeace and ask Russell, what is the potential for those types of relationships in terms of working alongside Greenpeace and all of us sort of networking together to sort of form this sort of resistance sort of framework in civil society where you're talking about the government has a monopoly on power, or it seems to have at the moment, but what is this period offering space for the emergence of new relationships built on sustainability, built on working together, Māori and Pacific communities, where I'm doing a lot of work. And I have an enormous respect for Greenpeace. So what's Greenpeace's take on those type of issues of the emergence of new networks emerging? And what do you have to say about it's like Gramsci's notion of resistance against hegemony, if you will, because that's what you've been talking about in some senses about civil society. But it's a broad question. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. What's your sense of the emergence of these networks, and what's Greenpeace's take on that? Because you're part of that network.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Tony. I mean, it's what did Gramsci say? We need more good sense rather than common sense. I think was one of his favorite phrases. And so I reckon. So there's kind of like there's different. The one way to think about it is the kind of the hegemonic sense, right? So all the organizations are repeating the same similar kinds of stories about, you know, let's change, right? Let's build back better. So there's a kind of shared counter hegemony, to use Gramsci's phrases, as you say. And so I think that's very, very valuable. And you can see it happening in my social media feed and elsewhere. There's a lot of similar kind of narratives from small organizations, big ones, individuals. And so I think that's at one level really good, right? And very important that we keep doing that. And I've been really, like I was, you know, when we started doing our green COVID work, I wasn't sure how it was going to land, right? Because, you know, you never know. People go, oh, you shouldn't be talking about what the recovery looks like. It's a health crisis. You know, we should only do blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? You get it a lot with climate change as well. Like, you shouldn't be talking about climate change when there's a drought. You know, you should just be focused on the emergency. But one of the things that I've been very, really has been great is to watch the response of lots of organizations who are in people, but lots of organizations who obviously felt that we did need to talk about how we were going to build back and how we could build back better and deal with a lot of the underlying issues. So I think that's been really fantastic. In terms of like one of the people who works with Greenpeace is Mike Smith, who you probably know, what the work Mike's been doing has been with the iwi chairs. And so he's been able to set up a kind of great network within iwi chairs to have a really significant impact on government thinking about how to respond to the crisis. And I think that's been a great initiative from the iwi Chairs Forum, with Mike leading it, whereby there's been a lot of repetition or reflection, similarity rather, between the kind of things that the iwi Chairs Forum has been pushing for and the things that the environment movement's been pushing for, and also various kind of Pākehā social movements. But that to me has I think demonstrated a tremendous a kind of alliance. It's not really, alliance is too strong a word, but a kind of working and sharing of ideas, which is having a real impact, I think, on the government's thinking about it, because they're getting it from many directions, you know. In terms of the kind of how Greenpeace works with other organizations, there's kind of, I'm not quite sure, I may have got the wrong end of the stick, but a lot of organizations are service providers or provide practical support, which it sounds like what you're doing. Greenpeace isn't really one of those things. All right, so I just think we need to be clear that Greenpeace is, you know, our job in this whole kind of ecosystem of change is we focus on the campaigning rather than doing the practical stuff. And you know, you might say, well, that's a bit of it's a weakness, I guess, in some ways of Greenpeace, in that we don't do much tree planting, we don't hand out food to people who need food, that kind of stuff. What we try to bring to the table is a kind of relentless focus on systemic change, to try to really hammer at the systems. And so that is what we think our kind of main contribution is, and we try to stay focused on that. So sometimes we're not as helpful as people might think we should be in a hands-on, practical way, because we are very focused on just trying to be that, the system change, the focus on the systems change stuff. So it's also about understanding what each organization, big or small, brings to the table, and respecting our differences. And I can't do some of the things that it sounds like you're doing, and vice versa, you know. But I do think that out of all of this, the kind of this virtual conversation we've all been having, like this, but many other places, I think will come a much greater understanding and empathy for each other's positions. And I think a broader understanding about what we'd like to replace what we had before with in the future. And I think that's been evolving organically, which has been great.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for probably one more question before we need to wrap up, but I'm aware that there are a few in the chat, so we will make sure that we get answers to all of the questions that anybody has put forth, and we email you all with those answers because we now have your emails. So if you don't have your question answered on the call today, we will make sure that we get your answer in the next couple of days. But another question I see that's popped up, that's come up a bit, I've heard out there in the community, so I think it's probably a good one to ask in this forum, is, Russell, do you think the proposed fast tracking of shovel-ready projects, which is bypassing the RMA and overseen by a panel of experts and an environmental court judge, is good enough to ensure that the right projects are selected?
So this is a very important question. So it's just, there's two distinct but related things that people need to just to try to explain. One is the RMA fast track process, right? And obviously that's highly problematic. We've been meeting with officials, ministers, trying to influence this process, right? The bill that's going to come up. And the cabinet paper is a lot better now than it was before, as a result of many organizations' influence on that. In nature of lobbying is you can't tell everything that's going on, right? But there has been a lot going on, believe me, behind the scenes to try to influence this and to make it better. The political reality on this fast track thing is that Labor feels like they have to do it, right? So that's just, and that's really clear. They're not going to not do it, right? They feel like the pressure from National means they've got to do it. Right. I mean, that's just, I think, and I can't overturn that. So what we're trying to do is influence the kind of public participation guarantees and sustainability guarantees within the fast track thing, right? And it's a lot better than it was. I wouldn't have done it myself. It's not my preferred outcome, but it's certainly, yeah, a lot better than it was. So we'll be watching that closely, and I think other people will too. We'll probably want to be one of the designated organisations that has rights of consultation under the restricted public participation process of it, and we'll try to use that right to facilitate other people's entry into the process. I think that's our responsibility if that happens, and I think it's quite likely to happen. Iwi and Hapu are going to have rights in the public participation process and a kind of list of designated environment NGOs. And I think it's the responsibility of any organisation that's on the list of designated civil society institutions that can make submissions that they help facilitate others' entry into the process, and we'll certainly take that on board. So that's the RMA fast track process. The other process is the infrastructure spend, right, which is related but distinct. So that's the billions of dollars, and what on earth is it going to get spent on? And it might be that some of these infrastructure spends need to go through the fast track process, or do go through the fast track process, but not all of them necessarily will. And there's a different issue there, which is the money, right? So it's the government money, it's the borrowed money that's going to be spent on these projects. So influencing the criteria for the selection of those processes is really important. So the infrastructure reference group that came up with the first list, it's a very conservative group, right? The shovel ready, right? And I agree with whoever was saying the critique of the shovel ready idea is it's very much focused on man with shovel, you know, building a motorway. And we don't need that kind of stuff, right? So the criteria, trying to influence those criteria is really important. One of the problems we have is a kind of path dependency problem, right? The people that are best ready to pitch shovel-ready infrastructure projects are the people who've been building all the infrastructure projects that have got us into this bloody mess, right? Because they're all set up to do it. That's what they do. So there's a path dependency problem, right? And so the first round of infrastructure projects, I'm hoping that we will knock out the worst ones by putting in some good criteria to stop them getting funding. I don't know if we're going to win, right? It's a big battle inside government right now as to what are the projects that are going to get the funding, even before the which projects are going to be given the fast track, right? And the problem is fundamentally a path dependency problem. So we've been putting up some very specific projects that we think are ready to go, like home insulation, solar panels, tree planting, right? So we've been trying to identify what are the projects that we could, because we did the home insulation scheme with John Key previously, so we kind of know how to do that. It's all ready to go, right? You can scale that thing back up again, right? We did in the past. So we've been trying to get some projects in there that can suck up the money and stimulate jobs and all that, and help, right? And get them to be competing with the other projects, which is going to be the predominant project that's going to come from the infrastructure reference group. They're going to be bad projects predominantly, I suspect. So that's the first phase of this thing. And then the next phase is what are the projects that can be built over the next 12 months or so? And there's a bit more space in there to have some creativity. And then what are the projects that are going to be like a 2 more year kind of project? And how do we facilitate getting some spending into some good projects that change, that they're an inflection point in the course of history. So they're the projects that we're really focused on, is how do we get some of those projects funded and decisions made to fund now? Because if they make a decision to fund them now, even if they take a while to roll them out, the decision will stick. That was the experience with the City Rail link in Auckland, which the National Party government, when they came in, were kind of stuck with, because the inflection point had already happened. The key commitments were already made. They couldn't turn it back, even though they hated it. So there is some key projects now with this government in place that if we can get some commitments to, then I think that will have a positive impact. Sorry, I've talked far too long, but kind of understanding that infrastructure pipeline and the kind of early and late phases of it is very important. And while the fast track legislation is a part of it, it's not necessarily the biggest part of the picture. It's an important part of the picture, but the infrastructure, what they spend the money on, is also tremendously important.
Thank you, Russell. Thanks for your time and sharing your insights on the difficult times and how we campaign.